The thing about grain in the high country is that it fights you at every turn. Samuel Bridger learned this in the autumn of 1837 when he hauled 300 pounds of wheat and corn up to his cabin in the Absaroka Range, 11 miles from the nearest trading post, and watched helplessly as winter prepared to make a fool of him. At 9,000 feet, the seasons don't transition. They ambush. September can break your back with heat that turns a log cabin into a Dutch oven. And by October, frost creeps through cracks you didn't know existed, turning that same cabin into a meat locker that'll freeze your water bucket solid by morning. Samuel knew this. Every mountain man worth his salt knew this. But knowing and solving are two very different animals, and that autumn Samuel was staring down a problem that had broken better men than him. He'd spent the better part of August preparing. The wheat and corn represented 6 months of trapping profits, traded at Fort Union for 200 miles of hard travel. It was his insurance policy, his winter lifeline, the difference between making it to spring or becoming another cautionary tale that trappers would tell around fires. 300 pounds might not sound like much, but up here it was a king's ransom. It was bread. It was porridge. It was the foundation that kept a man alive when the elk moved to lower country and the trout froze under 3 feet of ice. The wind that September carried the smell of pine resin and coming snow, and Samuel stood in his cabin doorway looking at the sacks of grain piled against the north wall, and felt the first cold finger of dread touch his spine. Because he knew what was coming. He'd seen it before during his first winter in these mountains 5 years back, when he'd been green as spring grass and twice as foolish. The cabin itself was solid work. Samuel had built it the way every mountain man built their winter quarters, following the wisdom passed down from French trappers, from Hudson's Bay men, from the old hands who'd worked these ranges since the turn of the century. Logs notched tight, chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace that drew clean, a plank door hung on leather hinges, and shutters that could be barred against wind, and worse. The floor was packed earth, smooth as river stone from years of use. By any reasonable measure, it was good shelter. It had kept him alive through 4 winters. It would keep him alive through this one. But that grain, that damned grain. Samuel had stored it the conventional way, the way everyone stored their supplies. The wheat and corn sat in their burlap sacks, stacked against the coolest wall, away from the fireplace, up on a platform of split logs to keep them off the damp earth. This was standard practice. This was what worked in lower elevations, in settlements, in forts. Keep it dry, keep it cool, keep it away from rodents. Simple, sensible, proven. Except up here, at this elevation, in these particular mountains where the seasons were weapons and the elements had no mercy, standard practice had a way of becoming a death sentence. The first problem announced itself within a week. The September heat wave hit like a punishment, temperatures climbing into the 80s, even at 9,000 feet, the sun beating down through a crystalline sky that seemed too blue to be real. Inside the cabin, it was worse. The logs that would be a blessing in winter became a curse in late summer, holding heat like a kiln. The temperature inside climbed to 90, 95, pushing toward 100 on the worst days. Samuel kept the door open, kept the windows unshuttered, but it didn't matter. Heat accumulated in that space like water in a cistern, and there was nowhere for it to go. He checked the grain on the 3rd day of the heat wave. The burlap was warm to the touch. He opened one sack and plunged his hand in, feeling the kernels of wheat. They were hot, not warm. Hot. Like they'd been sitting in sunshine, except they'd been in shadow the whole time. He knew what that meant. The grain was cooking in its own heat, the moisture inside each kernel beginning to activate, beginning to ferment, beginning that slow transformation from food into rot. Samuel had seen this before. In his first winter, he'd watched 100 pounds of cornmeal go bad in 3 weeks, turning from golden yellow to gray-green, developing that sweet, sick smell of decay that meant the whole batch was ruined. He'd lost 20 pounds that winter, his body eating itself because he'd gambled on stored grain and lost. He'd survived on whatever small game he could trap, and the mercy of a winter that turned out milder than expected. But you don't count on mild winters in the Absaroka Range. You plan for the worst, and even then, the mountains find ways to surprise you. He opened another sack, then another. All of them were warming, that heat building from the inside out, that moisture beginning its terrible work. At this rate, he'd lose half the supply before the first snow fell, and that was just the first problem. The second problem came with the cold. October arrived like a door slamming shut. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single night, frost painting the meadow grass silver, ice forming in the water trough. Samuel woke to a cabin that had gone from oven to icebox in the space of 8 hours, his breath fogging in the gray pre-dawn light. The grain, which had been too hot a week ago, was now too cold. He could feel it through the burlap. The moisture that had been activated by the heat was now freezing, expanding, cracking the kernels from the inside. Freeze, thaw, freeze, thaw, each cycle doing damage that couldn't be undone. And then there were the visitors. Samuel found the first evidence on a morning in mid-October. Tiny black droppings scattered across the grain platform, gnaw marks on the corner of a burlap sack. A small hole, barely bigger than his thumb, chewed through the fabric. He'd seen this in grain storage before, but never this fast, never this bold. The mice had found his winter supply, and they were moving in with the confidence of creatures who knew they'd hit the jackpot. In the high country, mice aren't like their lowland cousins. They're survivors, adapted to this brutal environment, and they breed with a ferocity that borders on the supernatural. One pregnant female can become 50 mice by spring. Those 50 can destroy a man's entire food supply, not just by eating it, but by contaminating it with their droppings, their urine, their constant invasive presence. Samuel had known trappers who'd been forced to abandon their winter quarters because the mice had taken over so completely that the cabin itself became uninhabitable. He tried the standard deterrents. He moved the grain sacks onto higher platforms, built new ones that stood 3 feet off the ground. He set traps. He brought in his cat, a half-wild mouser he'd traded for at Fort Union. But the mice were relentless. They climbed. They jumped. They found paths that seemed physically impossible, squeezing through gaps that shouldn't have existed. The cat killed a dozen in the first week and barely made a dent in the population. By the end of October, Samuel had lost 20 pounds of grain to heat damage, another 15 to freeze-thaw cycles that left the kernels mealy and worthless, and an unknown amount to the mice, who were now bold enough to come out during the day, scurrying across the cabin floor like they owned the place. He sat by his fire one evening, watching the light fade through the open door, and did the math. At this rate, his 300-pound supply wouldn't last 1 season, let alone 3. He'd be lucky to see Christmas with enough grain to make a week's worth of bread. The mountain had taught him many lessons in his 5 years up here, but this one was particularly cruel. He'd done everything right, according to conventional wisdom, followed every rule, and it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The stakes weren't just about going hungry. Samuel understood with the clarity that comes from experience that this was about survival at its most fundamental level. The nearest settlement was an 11-mile trek through country that became impassable once the deep snows came. There was no riding into town for supplies in January, not at this elevation, not in these mountains. You came up in autumn with everything you needed, and you didn't leave until spring thaw. That was the contract you signed with the high country. Losing the grain meant losing his foundation. It meant relying entirely on hunting and trapping in an environment where game could disappear for weeks at a time, where a bad storm could keep you cabin-bound for days, where a broken leg or a deep cut could mean the difference between eating and starving. The grain was supposed to be his constant, his reliable baseline. Meat was seasonal, but grain was supposed to be forever. Samuel had seen what happened to men who lost their food supplies midwinter. He'd found Jacob Thompson in February of 1835, 10 miles south, in a cabin that still had firewood stacked outside. Jacob had starved to death with fuel to keep him warm, his body curled on the bunk, his journal documenting his slow decline. The last entry was barely legible. "Can't keep nothing down, too weak to trap, God forgive me." Samuel had buried him in the spring thaw and burned his journal, but those words had never left him, and there was another element to the stakes, one that cut deeper than mere survival. Samuel had a partner joining him this winter, Thomas Whitmore, a younger man, early 20s, eager to learn the mountain trade. They'd made the arrangement at the summer rendezvous. Thomas would winter with Samuel, learn the craft of trapping, the skills of wilderness survival, and in return, Samuel would get help with the heavy work, someone to share watches, someone to talk to during the long, dark months when isolation could drive a man to strange places in his own head. Thomas was due to arrive in 3 weeks, coming up from Fort Union with his own supplies and equipment. Samuel had promised him a solid winter, good training, and enough food to see them both through to spring. If the grain supply was already failing, if the mice were already winning, what kind of teacher did that make him? What kind of mountain man couldn't even keep his own food stores secure? The thought sat in his gut like a stone, but it was more than pride. Thomas was depending on him. The young man was coming up here based on Samuel's reputation, his supposed expertise. If the food situation collapsed, both of them would pay the price. Samuel would be responsible not just for his own suffering, but for Thomas's as well. That weight pressed on him as he sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the first real bite of winter wind coming through the gaps in the logs. The nights were getting longer, the temperatures were dropping, the mice were multiplying, and Samuel's 300 pounds of grain was dwindling with each passing day, victim to heat, cold, moisture, and an army of tiny teeth that never stopped gnawing. He knew he couldn't continue this way. The conventional wisdom had failed him. The standard practices weren't enough. He needed something different, something better, something that understood the specific brutality of this elevation, this climate, these mountains that cared nothing for what worked everywhere else. The question was, what? Samuel began to pay attention in a way he hadn't before. When you're desperate, when the old methods have proven themselves worthless, you start looking at the world with different eyes. You stop assuming you know the answers and start asking better questions. The mountains had always been his teacher, but now he became a more devoted student, watching, listening, thinking. He started with the mice. What were they doing that worked? How were they surviving up here when everything else seemed to be struggling? He spent hours observing them, not with the irritation of a man trying to kill them, but with the curiosity of someone trying to understand a superior adaptation. The mice cached their food. This wasn't new information, but Samuel had never really thought about it. He'd seen their little hoards before, seeds and nuts tucked into cracks in rocks, stuffed into hollow logs, buried in shallow depressions under pine needles. But now he watched how they did it. They didn't put all their food in one place. They created multiple caches spread across their territory. If one cache was discovered by a predator or ruined by moisture, they had others. They were hedging their bets, spreading their risk. And where they cached the food mattered. They avoided places that were too warm or too cold. They seemed to prefer locations that maintained a steady temperature, protected from direct sun, but also insulated from severe frost. Samuel followed one particularly industrious mouse for the better part of a week, mapping its behavior. It had 7 different caches within 50 yards of the cabin. Each one was in a slightly different microenvironment, some under rocks, some in tree hollows, some buried under layers of forest duff. Then there was the matter of how native peoples in this region stored their food. Samuel had lived among the Crow for a winter 3 years back, when a broken leg had left him dependent on their hospitality. He'd watched how they preserved meat, how they stored roots and berries, how they kept food through seasons that would have broken a white man's standard storage methods. The Crow dug pits, not shallow pits, but deep ones, 4 or 5 feet down into the earth. They lined these pits with grass and bark, filled them with dried meat or pemmican or roots, and then covered them with more grass, more bark, layers of earth, and finally a large flat stone. The pits were never near their lodges. They were out in the forest, in places that looked unremarkable, that could be covered with snow, and rediscovered in spring by memory and careful mapping. Samuel had asked about this once. An old woman, her face like carved wood, had explained through signs and broken English that the earth was steady, not like the air, which changed from hot to cold, wet to dry, calm to violent. The earth, once you got below the surface, stayed the same temperature. Winter, summer, it didn't matter. 2 feet down, the earth was cool but not frozen. Stable. Constant. That's what food needed. Not warm, not cold, steady. He'd filed that information away at the time, interesting, but not immediately useful. Now it came back with the force of revelation. Samuel also thought about root cellars, the kind settlers built back east. But those required specific construction, access to good digging tools, time he didn't have before the hard freeze set in, and most importantly, they required proximity to the house. Every root cellar he'd ever seen was attached to or very near the main dwelling, access through a trap door or a side entrance. That made sense for a family homestead, but for a single man 11 miles from anywhere, there might be other considerations. He thought about the duality of the cabin environment. Too hot in summer, too cold in winter. But what if he could find a place that wasn't subject to those extremes? What if he could find or create a microclimate that stayed consistently cool year-round, protected from the temperature swings that were destroying his grain? The answer came to him during a morning hunt. Samuel was tracking elk through a dense stand of spruce, following a game trail that wound between massive boulders, when he passed by a rock formation he'd noticed before, but never really examined. It was a tumble of granite slabs, probably dumped there by a glacier 10,000 years ago, stacked and leaning against each other in ways that created gaps and spaces underneath. He'd used these formations before as temporary shelter during sudden storms, ducking into the openings to wait out squalls that could blow through with shocking speed. On impulse, he set down his rifle and crawled into one of the larger openings. It was a space maybe 8 feet deep, 4 feet wide, tall enough that he could crouch but not stand. The floor was gravel and small stones. The walls were solid granite on 3 sides, open to the air on the 4th, facing north, away from the direct sun, and it was cool, not cold, not warm, just cool, steady, consistent. Samuel stayed there for a few minutes, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the air on his skin. No wind penetrated this space. The rocks blocked it. But there was air circulation, a gentle flow that kept things from getting stale. The temperature felt like a spring morning, that perfect balance between warm and cool that you only get for a few weeks each year. He crawled back out and looked at the rock formation with new eyes. This wasn't just a pile of boulders. This was natural architecture, created by forces beyond human comprehension, shaped over eons into something that solved problems he was only now beginning to understand. The granite held temperature. It absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, acting as a thermal mass that resisted change. In summer, when the air above was scorching, the rocks stayed cool because they were insulated by their own mass and by the earth beneath them. In winter, when the air above dropped below zero, the rocks stayed above freezing because they were protected from the worst of the cold by layers of stone and trapped air pockets. This was what the old Crow woman had been talking about. Stability. The earth, the stone, they didn't swing from hot to cold like the air did. They maintained. They persisted. Samuel explored the boulder field for the next hour, finding dozens of similar spaces, all with the same characteristics: cool, dry, protected. Some were larger, some were smaller, but all of them represented something he'd been searching for without knowing it: natural cold storage. Not cold storage in the sense of frozen, but in the sense of steady, reliable coolness that wouldn't cook his grain in summer or freeze it in winter. Over the next 3 days, Samuel tested his theory. He took small samples of grain, sealed them in smaller burlap bags, and placed them in 3 different rock caches. He left identical samples in his cabin, in the same location where the main supply was stored. Then he waited, checking them daily, monitoring the temperature, watching for any signs of heat damage, moisture accumulation, or rodent activity. The results were undeniable. The grain in the cabin continued to degrade. The morning of the 3rd day, Samuel opened the cabin sample and found it warm to the touch, the kernels slightly sticky with moisture that had nowhere to go. The grain in the rock caches was cool, dry, and showed no signs of stress. The temperature inside those stone spaces barely varied, staying consistently around 50 degrees, regardless of whether the outside air was 70 or 30. And the mice didn't find them. This was perhaps the most surprising discovery. Samuel had expected that rodents would discover the caches eventually. They were clever, persistent, and had an uncanny ability to locate food. But the rock caches were different from a cabin. There were no regular paths leading to them, no familiar scents, no established territory. The caches were out in the forest, part of the wild landscape, and the mice that lived out there had their own territories, their own food sources. They didn't automatically investigate every rock formation looking for human food. Samuel's mind began to race with possibilities. If he could cache his grain in these natural stone vaults, he could solve multiple problems at once. The temperature would be stable. The moisture would be controlled by the natural air circulation. The rodents would have a harder time finding it. And if he created multiple caches spread across different locations, he'd be following the same risk management strategy that had kept the mice alive for millennia. But there was more to it than just finding the right storage locations. Samuel began to think about how grain was packaged, how it was sealed, how it was protected from the elements. The burlap sacks that were standard for transport were terrible for long-term storage. They were porous, they absorbed moisture, they were easily chewed through by rodents, and they did nothing to create a sealed environment. He remembered something else from his time with the Crow. They didn't just throw food into their storage pits. They wrapped it. They used hides, rawhide specifically, sewn into tight bags that were then sealed with rendered fat. The rawhide kept moisture out, kept scent in, created a barrier that was much harder for animals to penetrate. When they retrieved food from these pits months later, it was in the same condition as when it had been stored, sometimes even better, as the controlled environment had allowed proper aging without spoilage. Samuel didn't have the resources to create proper rawhide bags, not in the time he had before Thomas arrived, but he had something else. He had several large ceramic crocks that he'd hauled up the mountain over the years, used for storing rendered fat, pickling vegetables, and fermenting small batches of spruce beer. The crocks were heavy, awkward to transport, but they had one critical advantage. They were impermeable. Nothing got in or out unless you removed the lid. And he had pine pitch, endless amounts of pine pitch collected from the surrounding forest. Pine pitch, when heated and strained, became a sealant that could make any joint waterproof, airtight. Trappers used it to waterproof their canoes, their shelters, their boots. Samuel realized he could use it to seal his storage crocks, creating an environment that was not just protected, but hermetically sealed. The plan crystallized in his mind over the course of a single evening, sitting by his fire, watching the light play across the cabin walls. He would divide his grain supply. Instead of keeping 300 pounds in one location, vulnerable to a single catastrophe, he would create 3 separate caches, each containing roughly 100 pounds. He would store the grain in his ceramic crocks, sealed with pine pitch, and place those crocks in carefully selected rock formations scattered across a 2-mile radius from his cabin. The locations would be mapped, memorized, marked with subtle signs that only he would recognize. Each cache would represent roughly 1 season's supply. If one cache was discovered by animals or damaged by some unforeseen event, he'd still have 2 others. The risk was distributed, the storage was optimized for the environment, and the entire system was designed not around human convenience, but around what actually worked in these specific mountains. But Samuel knew that the key to making this work wasn't just the technical details of storage. It was the mindset shift. The conventional wisdom said you kept your supplies close under your direct supervision, where you could see them and protect them. That made sense in settled areas where theft was a concern, where you had neighbors and potential threats. But up here, the threats were different. The biggest danger wasn't other people. It was the environment itself. And the environment didn't care about your cabin, your locks, your direct supervision. The environment was going to do what it did, and if your storage method couldn't adapt to that, you were going to lose. Samuel realized that what he was planning went against every instinct he'd developed as a settler, as a civilized man. You didn't scatter your food across the wilderness. You didn't bury it in secret locations. You didn't create a system that required trust in the landscape itself. But that's exactly what survival up here demanded. Trust the earth, trust the stone. Trust the principles that had kept wild things alive long before humans ever arrived. He spent the next week executing his plan with a precision that bordered on ritual. First, he selected his cache sites. He chose 3 rock formations, each about 3/4 of a mile from his cabin, positioned in different directions to spread the risk. The first was northeast, in a boulder field similar to where he'd made his initial discovery. The second was southwest, in a collapsed cliff face that created a series of caves and overhangs. The third was due west, under a massive granite slab that leaned against the mountain slope at an angle, creating a protected space underneath. Each location had the same characteristics: good air circulation, protection from direct weather, solid granite walls that would maintain stable temperature, and concealment from casual observation. Samuel marked each location with subtle signs, a pattern of stones that would look natural to anyone else, but that he could recognize instantly. He also memorized the approach to each cache, counting paces, noting distinctive trees or rock features, creating a mental map that didn't rely on anything that could be destroyed by fire or flood. Next, he prepared his containers. He had 7 ceramic crocks in total, ranging in size from 2 gallons to 5 gallons. He cleaned them thoroughly, dried them in the sun, and inspected each one for cracks or flaws. Then he began the careful work of transferring grain from the burlap sacks to the crocks, using a funnel made from rolled birch bark, working slowly to avoid spillage. The wheat went into the larger crocks. The corn went into the smaller ones. He left a small amount of airspace at the top of each crock, maybe an inch, to allow for any minor expansion or settling. Then came the sealing process. Samuel had collected pine pitch from several trees, rendering it down in a small pot over his fire, straining out the impurities through a piece of linen. The result was a clear golden resin that remained liquid when heated, but hardened quickly when cooled. He poured the hot pitch around the rim of each crock lid, creating a seal that bonded the ceramic to ceramic, forming a barrier that was truly airtight. The smell was intoxicating, sharp and clean, the scent of the forest concentrated into liquid form. As the pitch cooled, it hardened into a seal that would take a sharp knife to break. Nothing was getting into these containers. Not moisture, not air, not mice, nothing. The physical work of transporting the crocks to their cache locations took 3 days, each crock filled with grain, weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. Samuel could carry one at a time, making the journey to each cache multiple times, always approaching from different directions, never creating an obvious trail. He was being paranoid, but up here, paranoia was just good sense. At each cache site, he arranged the crocks carefully on flat stones, elevated slightly off the gravel floor to ensure air circulation underneath. He surrounded them with additional stones to create a kind of protective wall, and then he camouflaged the entrance to each cache with branches, pine needles, and smaller rocks that looked like natural debris. When he was finished, each cache site looked like nothing more than an unremarkable pile of boulders in an unremarkable forest. The entire process took 2 weeks, 2 weeks of careful, deliberate work done with a precision that would have seemed obsessive to an outside observer. But Samuel wasn't doing this for show. He was doing it because his life, and Thomas's life, depended on getting it right. When he was finished, he had successfully cached 210 pounds of his grain supply across 3 secure locations. He kept 90 pounds in the cabin, stored in 2 sealed crocks, enough for immediate use over the next month or so. This was his working supply, easily accessible, enough to make bread and porridge without having to trek out to the caches every few days. But the bulk of his food was now distributed across the landscape, protected by stone and earth, and the principles he'd learned from watching mice and remembering crow wisdom. Thomas arrived the first week of November, right on schedule. He came up the trail from Fort Union with 2 pack mules, his trapping gear strapped across their backs, his own supplies bundled in canvas wraps. He was younger than Samuel had remembered, maybe 23, with the kind of lean build that spoke of hard work and not enough food growing up. But his eyes were sharp, and he moved with the efficiency of someone who knew how to work. They spent the first few days getting Thomas settled, organizing the cabin, establishing routines. Samuel watched the young man carefully, looking for signs of weakness or foolishness, and found neither. Thomas listened more than he talked, asked good questions, and didn't complain about the cold or the isolation or the endless small tasks that made up winter living in the high country. It was Thomas who noticed the grain situation, or rather, the apparent lack of one. They were preparing dinner on the 3rd evening, and Thomas had gone to the grain sacks to measure out cornmeal for Johnny cakes. He'd paused, looked around the cabin, and then turned to Samuel with a slightly confused expression. "This all the grain we got?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Not accusatory, just curious. Samuel looked up from the fire. "For now," he said. Thomas frowned. "This ain't but maybe 90 pounds. We're going to need more than that to get through to spring." "Got more?" Samuel said. "Just not here." "Where then?" And Samuel told him. Not the specific locations, not yet, but the general concept. Multiple caches distributed across the area, stored in sealed containers in natural cold storage. As he explained, he watched Thomas's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, skepticism, and finally, a dawning comprehension. "You scattered our food across the forest," Thomas said slowly. "I did." "That's wub." Thomas paused, clearly searching for the right word. "That's different." "It works," Samuel said. "That's what matters." "What if we can't find it? What if the snow covers everything?" "We'll find it," Samuel said. "I've got it mapped. And even if we couldn't find one cache, we'd still have 2 others." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, digesting this information. Then he asked the question Samuel had been expecting. "Why? Why not just keep it all here, where we can see it?" And Samuel told him about the mice, about the temperature swings, about the heat damage and the freeze-thaw cycles, about watching 100 pounds of good grain turn into compost because the cabin environment was all wrong for long-term storage. He told him about the crow storage pits, about the mice caches, about the principles of temperature stability and risk distribution. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when Samuel was finished, the young man nodded slowly. "So you built a better pantry," he said. "Just put it out there instead of in here." "That's one way to think about it," Samuel agreed. "The other trappers know about this? The men at Fort Union?" Samuel shook his head. "Doubt it. Most men do what I used to do. Keep everything in the cabin, hope for the best, and replace what goes bad come spring. Works well enough if you're only staying one season or if you got regular access to trading posts, but up here, this far out, you need something better." Thomas looked around the cabin at the two sealed crocks that represented their immediate supply, and Samuel could see the wheels turning in the young man's head. "If this works," Thomas said carefully, "if the grain in those caches stays good all winter, this could change things. This could mean a man could stay up here longer, go farther out, not have to worry so much about his food going bad." "That's the idea," Samuel said. The first real test came in early December. The temperature had been dropping steadily, hovering around zero most days, plunging to 20 below at night. The cabin stayed warm with the fire going, but stepping outside was like walking into a wall of frozen knives. The wind came down from the high peaks with a ferocity that made even short trips out for firewood an ordeal. They'd gone through their immediate supply of grain more quickly than Samuel had anticipated. Thomas was a big eater, burning calories like kindling, and Samuel found himself matching the younger man's appetite without thinking about it. On the morning of December 10th, Samuel opened their last cabin crock and estimated they had maybe a week's supply left. Time to make the trek to one of the caches. He chose the northeast cache, the one in the boulder field. It was the closest, and the approach was relatively sheltered from the worst of the wind. They set out after breakfast, both men bundled in their heaviest furs, carrying empty pack baskets and a small axe for clearing any ice that might have formed at the cache entrance. The forest was transformed. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into shapes that looked like frozen waves. The trees were weighted down with it, their branches bent almost to breaking, creating a landscape that was both beautiful and hostile. Samuel led the way, breaking trail, with Thomas following in his footsteps. It took them 2 hours to cover the 3/4-mile distance. When they reached the boulder field, Samuel paused, getting his bearings. The snow had changed everything, covering his subtle markers, altering the landscape, but the boulders themselves were still visible, massive shapes humped under white blankets, and he counted them off, working from memory, until he was standing in front of the right formation. The entrance to the cache was completely blocked with snow. They spent 20 minutes digging, using the axe and their gloved hands, clearing a path through the drift. When they finally exposed the opening, Samuel crawled inside, his breath fogging in the dark space, and found his crocks exactly where he'd left them, arranged on their stone platforms, untouched. He pulled out his knife and carefully broke the pine pitch seal on one crock, working the blade around the rim until the lid came free with a small pop of released air. The smell that emerged was perfect, that clean grain scent with no hint of mold or fermentation. Samuel reached in and pulled out a handful of wheat, examining it in the dim light filtering through the entrance. The kernels were dry, firm, cool to the touch, no stickiness, no softness, no discoloration. He bit down on one experimentally, feeling it crack between his teeth with the right texture. This grain was as good as the day he'd sealed it 2 months ago, maybe better, having aged in a controlled environment that prevented any degradation. "Thomas," he called, "come look at this." Thomas crawled into the cache, and Samuel showed him the wheat, explained what to look for, let the young man feel the texture, smell the clean scent. "This is what good grain looks like after 2 months in storage," Samuel said. "Compare it to what we had in the cabin, how that was starting to get sticky, how it smelled a little off. This is perfect." They loaded 2 crocks into their pack baskets, sealed the cache again, and made the trek back to the cabin. The return journey was easier, following their already broken trail, and they were back by mid-afternoon. That evening, Thomas made bread with the cached wheat, and both men agreed it was the best bread they'd had in months. The texture was right, the flavor was clean, no hint of the off-tastes that came from grain that had been stressed by poor storage. "I'll be damned," Thomas said, chewing thoughtfully. "It actually works better than keeping it in the cabin." "Earth knows how to keep things," Samuel said. "We just had to figure out how to work with it instead of against it." The winter deepened. January brought storms that lasted for days, winds that shook the cabin walls, temperatures that made it painful to breathe outside air. They burned through firewood at a steady rate, kept the fire going around the clock, ventured outside only when necessary. And every 3 weeks or so, when their immediate grain supply ran low, Samuel made the trek to one of the caches, bringing back fresh supplies that were consistently in perfect condition. He rotated through the 3 caches systematically, never taking from the same one twice in a row, always checking the others to ensure they remained secure and undiscovered. Each time, the grain was exactly as it should be, cool, dry, perfect. The rock formations maintained their stable temperature even as the outside world swung from -30 to occasional warm-ups into the 20s. The sealed crocks kept everything protected. The distributed system meant they always had backup if one cache failed, but none of them failed. By February, Samuel had a tracking system written in his journal, noting which crocks they'd opened, how much they'd taken from each cache, what remained. He realized with a growing sense of satisfaction that his original 300-pound supply was lasting far better than it ever had before. In previous winters, keeping grain in the cabin, he'd lost at least 30% to damage, spoilage, and rodent depredation. This winter, his losses were nearly zero. The real test came in March, during what old-timers called the hungry time. This was when winter supplies typically ran lowest, when cabin fever and isolation started to wear on men's minds, when the calendar said spring, but the weather said winter, for at least another month. This was when food shortages became critical, when poor planning or bad luck could turn survival into catastrophe. Samuel and Thomas were running their trap lines one afternoon when they crossed paths with another mountain man, Jack Reardon, working his way down from a higher camp. Jack looked rough, his face gaunt, his movements slower than they should have been. When they stopped to talk, sharing the trail courtesy of passing information and news, Jack mentioned he was heading down to Fort Union early. "Food situation's bad," Jack said bluntly. "Lost most of my grain to mice in January. What's left ain't fit to eat. Got enough jerky to make it down to the fort, but that's about it. Can't stay up here with no proper food." Samuel and Thomas exchanged glances. They still had easily a month's supply, maybe 6 weeks if they stretched it. Their caches were still half full. There was no hint of food crisis in their situation. "How'd you store your grain?" Samuel asked. "Same as always," Jack said. "Sacks in the cabin. Kept it up on platforms, away from the walls. Did everything right. Didn't matter. Mice got into it anyway, and what they didn't eat, the damp got. Woke up one morning and half my supply had that gray mold on it. Had to throw it all out." Samuel nodded. He'd seen this story play out before. "You ever think about caching it?" he asked carefully. Jack frowned. "Caching? You mean like burying it?" "Not exactly," Samuel said. He explained the basic concept, watching Jack's face cycle through the same expressions Thomas had shown months ago. Confusion, skepticism, calculation. "That sounds like a lot of work," Jack said finally, "and a good way to lose your food if you can't find it again under the snow." "Works for us," Samuel said simply. Jack shook his head. "I'll stick to the tried and true. Just got unlucky this year, that's all. Happens sometimes." They parted ways, and after Jack had disappeared down the trail, Thomas turned to Samuel. "He ain't going to make it," Thomas said quietly. "He'll make it to the fort," Samuel replied. "That's all he needs. But he won't come back up. Not after this. He'll find some excuse, some reason why it makes sense to stay lower, work easier country, and in a few years he'll be telling stories about how the high country beat him." Samuel thought about that. Maybe Stoody. he said. Or maybe he'll ask around, hear about our system, try it himself next winter. If he believes it, Thomas said, that's the hard part, getting people to believe that something different could work better than what everyone's always done. They continued their trapline in silence, but Samuel kept thinking about that conversation, about how much of survival was physical and how much was mental, about how the biggest obstacle to improvement was often just the inability to imagine that there was a better way. April brought the first real signs of spring. The snow began to recede, slowly at first, then faster as the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Water ran everywhere, streams swelling, the forest filling with the sound of melt and drip and flow. The game started to move back into the high country. The first robins appeared, impossibly bright against the dirty snow. Samuel and Thomas made one final round of the caches in late April, retrieving the last of the stored grain. They opened each cache in turn, inspecting the crocks, documenting what they found. Every single container was in perfect condition. The grain was as good as the day it had been sealed. In fact, Samuel thought it might be even better, having spent 6 months in conditions that allowed proper aging without any of the stress factors that usually degraded stored grain. He did the final accounting in his journal. Of the original 300 pounds of grain he'd cached, they'd consumed approximately 260 pounds over the winter and early spring. Another 10 pounds remained in their working supply in the cabin. That left 30 pounds still in the caches, emergency reserves that could stay there until next winter if needed. The loss to spoilage, damage, or pests, 0. Samuel sat by the cabin fire that evening, running through the numbers again, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This hadn't been luck. This had been observation, adaptation, and a willingness to question conventional wisdom. He'd looked at what nature did, what native peoples did, what actually worked in this specific environment, and he'd built a system around those principles. The implications were significant. With this storage method, a man could extend his time in the high country. He could venture farther from trading posts. He could establish more permanent camps in areas that had previously been considered too remote. The limiting factor had always been food security, and food security had always been undermined by the harsh reality of mountain storage conditions. But now there was a solution. More importantly, the solution was replicable. It didn't require special materials or advanced construction skills. It required observation, some basic ceramics or watertight containers, pine pitch for sealing, and the ability to identify appropriate natural storage sites. Any mountain man with sense and patience could implement this system. Thomas came in from checking the horses, stomping the mud off his boots. "Saw fresh tracks up by the north cache," he said. "Bear, looks like. Big one." "They're waking up," Samuel said, "getting hungry after the long sleep." "That cache still sealed?" "Should be. Stone's thick enough that even a determined bear can't get to it. That's another advantage of the rock formations. Natural protection from predators that would tear apart a wooden shed or dig through a buried cache." Thomas poured himself coffee, sat down across from Samuel. "You thinking about writing this down, the storage system?" Samuel considered that. "Maybe," he said. "Might be useful for others." "Jack's story going to become more common," Thomas said. "More men pushing into the high country, trying to establish permanent camps. They're all going to face the same food storage problems you did. Most of them probably going to handle it the same way Jack did. Keep everything in the cabin, hope for the best, lose half of it to mice and mold." "Or they'll learn," Samuel said. "Word gets around. Someone tries something that works, other people take notice." "Only if they believe it," Thomas reminded him. "And a lot of old hands, they got their ways. They ain't interested in hearing that some new method might be better." Samuel nodded. That was the truth of it. The hardest part of sharing knowledge wasn't the sharing itself. It was getting people to set aside their assumptions long enough to consider that maybe, just maybe, their tried-and-true methods weren't actually the best possible approach. The next few weeks, as spring fully established itself and they prepared to move to their summer trapping grounds, Samuel found himself thinking about what Thomas had said, about documentation, about sharing, about the way good ideas spread or didn't spread, depending on factors that had nothing to do with whether the ideas actually worked. He'd seen too many men repeat the same mistakes, suffer the same failures, all because they assumed that what everyone did must be the right way to do things. He'd been one of those men, in his early years, losing food to storage problems that seemed inevitable until he realized they weren't. The knowledge he'd gained wasn't complex. It wasn't secret. It was just observation combined with a willingness to question assumptions. But that combination was apparently rare enough that most men never got there. They stayed stuck in patterns that worked marginally well, never quite failing enough to die, but never quite succeeding enough to thrive. Samuel decided to document his system, not as a formal treatise, but as a series of detailed notes in his journal. He described the rock formations he'd used, the characteristics that made them good storage sites. He explained the sealing process, the pine pitch method, the importance of temperature stability. He included sketches, measurements, specific details that would allow someone else to replicate his success. He also included his failures, the things he'd tried that hadn't worked, the early attempts at storage that had led to losses, the conventional methods that had proven inadequate. Because sometimes knowing what doesn't work was just as valuable as knowing what does. When the journal entries were complete, Samuel read them over, making small corrections, adding clarifications. Then he made copies of the key pages, writing them out again on separate sheets of paper that he could leave at Fort Union, posted on the bulletin board where trappers shared information about trails, game movements, and survival techniques. Thomas watched this process with approval. "That's good," he said. "That's how things get better. One person figures something out, shares it, next person builds on it, shares that. Pretty soon, everyone's doing better than they were before." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Or maybe people will look at it, shake their heads, and go back to doing things the way they always have." "Some will," Thomas agreed, "but not all. There's always a few who are paying attention, who are looking for better ways. Those are the ones who will try it, see that it works, and spread it further." Samuel sealed his copied notes in a piece of oiled cloth, preparing them for transport. He thought about Jack Reardon heading back to Fort Union early because his food situation had collapsed. He thought about all the other trappers and mountain men who'd face the same problems next winter and the winter after that, until someone showed them there was a better way. The thing about frontier survival, Samuel had learned, was that it wasn't just about individual toughness or determination. It was about accumulated wisdom, shared knowledge, the slow building of techniques that worked in specific environments. The frontier wasn't conquered by lone wolves who never learned from others. It was settled by people who paid attention, who borrowed good ideas wherever they found them, who weren't too proud to admit that maybe the native peoples who'd been here for thousands of years knew a few things worth learning. His grain cache system was just one small piece of that larger puzzle. But it was a piece that worked, that solved a real problem that could make the difference between a successful winter and a hungry retreat to lower elevations. As they packed up for the move to summer quarters, Samuel took one last walk to each of his cache sites. The snow was mostly gone now, the rock formation standing clear against the green of new growth. He could see the subtle markers he'd placed, still there, still recognizable, despite months of winter weather. Each cache had protected its contents perfectly, performing exactly as designed, based on principles that had been working for millennia before he'd been born. He thought about the lesson in that, about how the most reliable solutions were often the ones that worked with nature instead of against it, about how sustainability wasn't about dominating the environment, but about understanding it well enough to find your place within its patterns and rhythms. The cabin-based storage that had failed him represented a mindset of control and separation. Keep everything close, under your direct supervision, isolated from the wild. It made sense from a civilized perspective, but it ignored the reality of the mountain environment. The cabin was a human construct, subject to human limitations, vulnerable to the extreme temperature swings that the mountains dealt out without mercy. The cache system represented a different mindset, one of integration and humility. It acknowledged that humans weren't smarter than nature, just different. It borrowed from animal behavior, from native practices, from the physical properties of stone and earth. It distributed risk instead of concentrating it. It worked with the environment instead of trying to impose human preferences onto a landscape that didn't care about those preferences. Samuel realized that this was the real lesson, the one that went beyond grain storage, beyond any specific technique. Survival in extreme environments required a kind of flexible intelligence that combined knowledge from multiple sources, that wasn't too proud to learn from mice or too civilized to dig in the dirt like the crow. It required observation over assumption, testing over tradition, and a willingness to be wrong about things you'd previously been certain about. That spring, before he and Thomas descended to Fort Union with their winter's catch of furs, Samuel made a final entry in his journal. It wasn't about grain storage specifically. It was about the process of learning itself, about how the mountains taught their lessons to those willing to pay attention. He wrote, "The old hands at the fort told me the cabin was the place to keep food. Made sense. That's where everyone kept it. But the mountains don't care about what makes sense to men. They operate on their own principles, their own logic. The trick isn't to force your methods onto the mountains. It's to observe what the mountains are already doing, what works in this specific place, and build your methods around that. The mice taught me about distribution and risk. The crow taught me about earth temperature stability. The rocks taught me about thermal mass and natural insulation. I didn't invent anything. I just paid attention and combined what was already there. This grain cache system will keep a man alive for 3 seasons if he builds it right, but the real value isn't in the specific technique, it's in the mindset that created it. Observe, question, test, learn from everything, even things you think you already understand. That's the wisdom that'll keep you alive up here, not just in comfort, but in confidence, knowing that you're working with the mountains instead of against them. There's knowledge we've lost, coming from the cities to the frontier. Knowledge about living close to the land, about reading natural signs, about trusting systems that have been tested over thousands of years instead of dozens. Some call it primitive. I call it proven. The native peoples who thrived here before us, the animals that survive winters we can barely imagine, they all have lessons to teach. The wise man listens. The fool assumes he already knows everything he needs to know. I came up here 5 years ago thinking I understood survival because I could build a cabin and shoot a rifle. I've learned since that true survival is subtler than that. It's about integration, not domination. About finding your place in the patterns that were here long before you and will be here long after you're gone. The grain caches worked because they respected those patterns. They didn't try to create artificial conditions. They found natural conditions that were already optimal and simply utilized them. That's a lesson that applies to everything up here. Don't fight the mountains. Learn from them. They've been solving the problem of survival for millions of years. We've been at it for maybe a few thousand, and we're still making basic mistakes. Samuel closed his journal, wrapped it carefully in oiled leather, and packed it with the rest of his essential gear. The words were there now, recorded, available for anyone who might need them. Some would read them and understand. Others would dismiss them as the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the mountains. But for those who were ready to hear it, who were struggling with the same problems he'd faced, who were humble enough to question their assumptions, the knowledge was waiting. Not as dogma, not as the one right way to do things, but as an example of what became possible when you paid attention and were willing to learn. Thomas shouldered his pack, ready to begin the descent. "You think anyone will actually use your cache system?" he asked. Samuel looked back at the cabin one last time, then up at the high peaks still capped with snow. "Some will," he said, "the ones who need it bad enough. The ones who've lost enough grain to mice and mold that they're willing to try something different. That's usually how it works. People don't change until the cost of staying the same becomes too high." They started down the trail, two men among hundreds working these mountains, carrying with them knowledge that had been tested against the harshest teacher of all, necessity. Behind them, hidden in rock formations that had stood for thousands of years, the last of the grain caches waited, their contents preserved perfectly, testament to the simple truth that sometimes the best technology is no technology at all. Just observation, understanding, and respect for the wisdom that's already present in the landscape. The mountains would still be there next winter, indifferent to human ambition, operating on principles that predated human consciousness. And somewhere in those mountains, men would be storing grain, facing the same problems Samuel had faced. Some would lose their food to the same old mistakes, but others, perhaps, would remember that there was a different way, a better way, proven by a mountain man who had learned to listen to mice and crow elders and the steady temperature of stone. That's how knowledge spreads on the frontier, not through formal instruction or written treatises, but through whispered conversations at trading posts, through copied journal pages tacked to bulletin boards, through the simple act of one person watching another succeed where conventional wisdom said they should have failed, and then going home and trying it themselves, finding that yes, it works, it actually works, and maybe telling someone else. 3 seasons from 300 pounds of grain, not through miracle or magic, but through observation and adaptation. That was the story, that was the lesson. And somewhere in the high country, right now, someone was facing the same decision Samuel had faced that autumn evening, looking at their grain supply, knowing the conventional method wasn't enough, wondering if there might be a better way. For them, Samuel had left his answer, not in the form of commands or certainties, but as a story of what worked for one man in one place, following principles that might work for others in other places if they were willing to pay attention and trust that the earth knew how to keep things steady, if you just gave it the chance. The secret wasn't secret at all. It was just forgotten or ignored or dismissed as primitive by people who'd learned to depend on structures instead of landscape, on control instead of cooperation. But it was there waiting, patient as the stones themselves, ready to be rediscovered by anyone humble enough to learn from sources that didn't come with formal credentials or civilized pedigrees. And that, perhaps, was the deepest lesson of all. That the frontier was full of teachers if you knew how to recognize them. That survival wasn't about dominating nature, but about finding your place within it. That the wisdom worth preserving wasn't always the wisdom that got written down in books or taught in schools. Sometimes it was just the knowledge of where to put your grain so the mice couldn't reach it, and the temperature stayed steady, and the seasons couldn't steal from you what you'd worked so hard to provide. Simple knowledge. Practical knowledge. The kind that meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving, between staying in the high country another year and retreating to easier ground. Samuel and Thomas reached Fort Union 2 weeks later, their furs bringing good prices, their supplies restocked for the summer season ahead. On the bulletin board near the trading post, Samuel tacked up his copied notes about grain storage, anchoring them with a nail so they wouldn't blow away. The notes hung there through the summer, weathering slowly, read by some, ignored by others. By autumn, when the trappers returned to prepare for another winter in the mountains, the papers were worn but still legible. And some men studying those notes by lamplight began to wonder about rock formations and sealed crocks and the temperature stability of Earth. Some would try it, some would succeed, and the knowledge would spread, one cache at a time, one mountain man teaching another that there was a way to make grain last not just 1 season, but 3. That was enough. That was all anyone could hope for, to solve a problem, to share the solution, to trust that those who needed it would find it. The mountains would do the rest, testing each man's methods against their unforgiving reality, proving what worked and discarding what didn't. And somewhere in those mountains, sealed in stone vaults scattered across the landscape, grain would be waiting, cool and dry and perfect, maintained by principles as old as the rocks themselves, kept safe by a system that didn't fight nature, but learned from it. That was the secret. That was the wisdom. And now for anyone willing to listen, it was theirs to use.